Welcome into edition 341 of CK Podcast. I'm Dustin Breakbill. We're going to talk to Brad Rowland from Peachtree Hoops of SB Nation and Locked On Hawks podcast. We're going to catch up with him and ask him what the Atlanta Hawks season was and what they will do with the number 3 picks following your Sacramento Kings, who have the second pick in next week's draft. So here's Brad Rowland. And now joining us on CK Podcast, episode 341, Brad Rowland from Peachtree Hoops and SB Nation and Locked On Hawks podcast. Brad, thank you for joining us this evening.
It's my pleasure. Always ready to talk some basketball, especially the draft. It's my favorite time of the year, so always a pleasure.
Silly season is upon us, and I love this time of the year. Free agency and the draft is speculation. So let's start with it, though. Let's start with the season recaps of the Atlanta Hawks, which you follow closely. 24-58 season. Mike Budenholzer was let go after the season. They bring in Lloyd Pierce, who was hired on June 8th. How would you describe Atlanta's season in one word?
Weird, I think, is the word I would use. Just because it's for the first time in a decade they were full-fledged rebuilding. They've been in the playoffs for a decade straight, and then you had this saga with Mike Budenholzer, sort of flirting with other jobs, finally taking another job, then a coaching search, and now a top 3 pick. So it kind of had everything, honestly, after a couple of kind of boring seasons when the Hawks were just a pretty good basketball team. It didn't have much going on. It's been very entertaining and strange, honestly.
So, as you said, Mike Budenholzer was flirting with jobs. He has another job now. What do you make of what Bud did in Atlanta, and how will fans what will his legacy be in Atlanta?
I think Bud is a fantastic basketball coach. I think he's, one of the top 10 or so coaches in the league and did a great job, earned a Coach of the Year nod that he ended up receiving in Atlanta. He was one of those that he actually definitely was the right choice in that year. So there are a couple of times where Coach of the Year is kind of interesting and it looks kind of bad in retrospect. That will not be the case for him. I think he did a fantastic job as a head coach. Unfortunately, he got a lot of power in the front office after the Danny Ferry fiasco, and as an executive, as a decision maker, as a roster constructor, he was not very good. Frankly, it was a combination of Budenholzer and a GM named Wes Wilcox. They didn't do the best job, I will say. I did not love a lot of what they did front office wise, but just as a coach, I think Bud will be remembered fondly. As a GM, sort of colors things a little bit, especially with the way that it all ended. So, for me, I will definitely give Bud positive marks. He did a very good job on the bench, and I still think he's a very good coach. And I thought Milwaukee should hire him in the way that they actually did. But in Atlanta, it'll probably be mixed to some degree because he left on his own volition, and the fact that the GM stuff did not go very well.
Brad Rowland's joining us. You can follow him on Twitter at BT Rowland. So Travis Schlenk, a former assistant here in Northern California in the front office-wise with the Golden State Warriors, now has the opportunity to pick a head coach, and he picked Lloyd Pierce, the former 76ers assistant. What do you think Lloyd's going to bring to Atlanta? And a lot of speculation is he's one of those far favorite assistants around the league that Atlanta basically got to pick up.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of very good things about Lloyd Pierce. Personally, my guard is always up with guys who've never been head coaches before at the NBA level, just because until you see a guy coach, you just kind of don't know. But the Hawks, I think, wanted a first-time head coach, or at least wanted someone who's very young, up-and-coming, player development focused. They were kind of honest about that. Their interview list only had one former head coach on it. It was David Fizdale, who's sort of that same mold of a young guy who's energetic. They wanted someone that can grow with this roster. They're very young right now. I think Pierce fits that bill. He said all the right things. I've been really interested in his profile and sort of talking to people around the league about the way that he coaches defense and the way that he really prioritizes developing players. Everything's very good. And so I have to say that, but in the same breath, you have to keep your guard up just because until you see a guy coach, you kind of just don't know 100%.
This is Travis Schlenk's real big first opportunity to dive into this. Basically, no more Mike Budenholzer. He took over in a weird situation Travis did. What do you think Travis is going to do this offseason to make his mark on this team?
I think it's going to be a relatively quiet offseason outside of the draft. Obviously, the Hawks have 4 picks in this draft, so they'll be very busy. They have been very busy in the lead up to the draft. After that, though, they're going to have some cap space, but this is a team that doesn't have really the incentive to go out and try to make a big splash in free agency. They're still in this rebuild, this pretty long rebuild process. I think they're probably more likely to use their cap space to take on a bad contract somewhere else, get an asset or two in exchange for that. That kind of salary dump kind of, modern day NBA trade that you see around the league. So I think it'll be a lot of draft stuff. And, last year was Schlenk's first draft. He kind of had just been hired at that point in time, and he nailed the first pick that he made with John Collins at number 19 overall. I think Collins, kind of regardless of where you fall on him, I think he proved to be a pretty darn good rookie. So getting a guy like that, number 19 overall, is a good way to make a statement right away for Travis Schlenk. But now he has his full handprint all over the roster. The team's still a couple of years away from actually contending for anything, but this draft is going to be really the point where he actually makes his mark, just because he's got 4 picks in the top 34 and a lot of leeway here.
We're talking to Brad Rowland from Peachtree Hoops and Locked on Hawks podcast. And you mentioned John Collins. Is that somebody I wanted to bring up? How would you overall give him a letter grade for last season? Because this was a guy coming into the last year's draft a lot of people were intrigued with as a big man, and Atlanta picked him up.
Yeah, I think honestly I have to give him probably an A, which is pretty strong, I think. But when you take into account where he was drafted at 19, most of the time a guy you're going to get there, you're hoping for a rotation player, honestly, just to be realistic at that spot. And Collins came in with basically already that kind of quality as a rookie. I think he's got upside beyond that. He's a great athlete, a very sort of a highlight kind of player that can dunk the ball and kind of just be up above the rim. But, fundamentally, he was way better defensively than I imagined, because that was the one knock on him that I had, that a lot of people had coming out of college, was his defense. I'm not saying he's going to be, prime Rudy Gobert or anything like that on the defensive end, but in the same breath, I think he can certainly be a pretty good defensive player with his tools now. And I didn't necessarily think that coming into his rookie season. So I think, by any rational expectation, he really exceeded that. And I would have to give him an A as a result of that. Doesn't mean he's going to be a star necessarily, but the Hawks were definitely on the right track. And at number 19, getting a rotation player, it looks like already as a rookie is a huge win for sure.
And let's switch to somebody who came into Atlanta. A lot of people liked because he's from Germany, and a lot of people were like, okay, let's see what Dennis Schröder had a couple of years ago. Do you think that the Hawks and Dennis Schröder need a fresh start? Because Dennis Schröder thinks they do.
I think so. I think it's time. Dennis has put up some big counting stats the last couple of years. He's had the ball in his hands a lot, monster usage. I think this year he had a top 10 usage rate in the league, and he's really the only guy on that list that you look at that's not an actual star. Every other guy that you see in that 30% usage rate kind of area is a star level player. He's just not that. I think he's a talented offensive player, but he's not a great shooter, which hurts him quite a bit. Not a great finisher. He's just more of a speed guy. And as he gets older, I do think that might decline a little bit. I think offensively he's probably a net positive, but with the way that he defended this year, it was really kind of bothersome to people around the team, from what I've heard. Just because Dennis didn't give a whole lot of effort, didn't really set the tone defensively. And when he came in the league, that was kind of what he was thought to be, was this high energy, defensive pest kind of guy. He's got great length, but now that he's had the ball in his hand so much, I think he sees himself as a star on offense, which he's not necessarily good enough to do that. And if you're not going to try on defense, it kind of makes people sour on you a little bit. Plus, as you mentioned before, it's sort of the comments this summer in Germany. I understand he was talking in German, but if you're in front of a microphone and a camera and you're naming teams that you want to be traded to, it's not the greatest situation in the world for a guy who's under contract for 3 more years in Atlanta. So I think there's a situation where the Hawks just can't trade him because he has 3 more years left at some pretty significant money. But if they're able to trade him without too much pain, I think they probably will look to do that if they're able to. So I think, more than likely he's not around next season, although you have to leave the door open just because he has so much money left in the contract.
Well, let's now go to draft night, which is a week away, June 21st. The Hawks have the number 3 pick. It goes Suns and Kings, and then it goes the Hawks. Where do you think the Hawks, what players are on their big board right now that they're looking forward to?
I think it's very interesting. This week they've been hosting the lottery guys. Early on in the process, they were hosting, because they had those other picks, they were hosting guys that were definitely more profiled in that 19, 30, 34 range. And this week it's been Trae Young, it's been Jaren Jackson Jr., Marvin Bagley, and Mo Bamba have all come to town. So basically, everyone they could probably take with that pick, aside from Luka Doncic, is going to be or has already been in Atlanta this week for an individual workout. Those guys are all on the radar. I think DeAndre Ayton is the guy you have to assume is gone. If not to Phoenix, which is everybody's assumption, probably Sacramento if he does not go to Phoenix, which is by some weird twist. So I think it's down to probably Doncic, Jaren Jackson, Marvin Bagley, and maybe Trae Young. There's a little bit of momentum on Trae Young locally because there's some whispers that the Hawks like him a lot. I'm not sure if that means they take him at 3, but they do have some interest there from everything that I've heard. So it's kind of a 3 or 4 player race at this point. Travis Schlenk, the GM, as you mentioned, has already kind of said that on the record a couple times, including this morning during a media availability. So one of those things where he's not going to be too specific, but I think they have a 3 or 4 player list. And when you're picking number 3, you can kind of have that kind of list and know that one of those guys is going to be there for you, even if they're not going to be 100% sure what the Kings do it to.
Will the Hawks be available on draft night if any teams want to move up, you think, or do they stick with that number 3 pick?
I think they're open to taking offers for sure. Travis Schlenk's been pretty open about the fact that they were looking to take calls and be open. I think they're willing to move down or up. Frankly, I think down is more likely than up, just because it's just always more likely. I think at that point in time in that draft, and because Phoenix doesn't seem to be overly interested in looking to move down. So unless the Kings and Hawks worked out something, which seems pretty unlikely to me at this point in time, it's more likely the Hawks move down. But I think ultimately the most likely scenario is that they just stand pat at 3, even if Schlenk has been and rightfully so. Like if you're a team like the Hawks or the Kings that's rebuilding and wants to look long term, you'd be kind of silly not to take calls, I think, at this point in time. But in the end, I would predict that they stand pat at 3. Just take the guy that takes the best player available. Which, on the bright side, if you're looking for optimism on the Hawks side, they don't have anybody on the roster right now that would preclude them taking somebody else in the draft. It's also a problem because that means you don't have any great players on your roster. But still, they kind of have a blank slate right now to take whoever they think is the best player, the best prospect available, and they'll probably just do that at 3.
You're listening to the CK Podcast. Dustin Breakbill talking to Brad Rowland from Peachtree Hoops and the Locked On Hawks podcast. We're talking NBA draft and we're talking the Atlanta Hawks. Okay, let's move on to some of those guys you mentioned. Jaren Jackson is somebody interesting who the Hawks are looking at also because he's around those picks. You said 3 after Luka and after Ayton. It's up to basically anybody. What do you feel about Jackson and how maybe the Hawks, how he would fit in there?
I love Jackson. I think he's a great prospect. I really value defense, and that's where I think he makes his money in the league. I think for me, he's the best defensive prospect in this whole class. I think you could certainly argue Mo Bamba because of his length. Just the absurd wingspan, all that stuff. But for me, Jackson's just so much more polished, better in space. I think he's just I think it'd be a pretty big surprise to me if he was not an awesome defender at some point in his NBA career. Offensively is where these questions come in, but I like his jump shot. I know it's not pretty necessarily, but it goes in, and it's kind of always gone in for Jaren Jackson. I think that's going to be something that he can use. He actually has some ball handling skills. He thinks the game at a pretty reasonable level. So I'm in on Jaren Jackson. I think if the Hawks are in a situation where it's Ayton and Doncic 1 and 2, Jackson will make a ton of sense at 3. I think he'd be a good compliment to John Collins as well. All things equal, he might be my guy at 3 if I was in that particular scenario. But he certainly would be in the mix. And I love his game. I've always loved his game. I think people have just kind of forgotten about him to a certain degree because of the way that he was deployed at Michigan State. I think if he had gone somewhere else, he might be a more consensus top 2 or 3 prospect. But for me, he's still up there, and he's very, very talented.
Let's go to somebody in Marvin Bagley, who I don't know if people have heard the news lately. He just signed a deal with Puma, the first person since Vince Carter in 1998 to do that. But how do you feel about Marvin Bagley?
First, congratulations to Marvin for getting all that money, because I'm sure it's going to be a lot of money to go to Puma. I like Marvin Bagley. I think the Hawks have been sort of weird. At one point, I heard the Hawks were not interested in Bagley, and then at one point, I think it was ESPN reported that they absolutely are. Some mixed signals there on Bagley, but he was in town this week for a workout and interview. Offensively, I like him a lot as a prospect. He's very, very athletic, very high motor guy on the offensive end of the floor. I think he can play in space and around the rim. I have very few questions about him offensively. The jump shot is kind of a question mark, but I think it's at least going to be solid enough. The big thing with Bagley is his defense, and that's probably why I would shy away from him just a little bit at number 3 overall. I think it wouldn't be bad to take him there, but I just don't necessarily see him as a primary rim protector at any point in time. I think his athleticism will definitely play in space because he is sort of a freak laterally and with his second jump ability, all that fun stuff. But just as a rim protector, I don't really see it. And that sort of lowers the ceiling a little bit defensively. But if you're looking for offense, and a lot of Hawks fans are, I think a lot of Hawks fans want somewhere they can go out and maybe average 20 and 10 in the league. If that's your primary focus, I can see why you like Marvin Bagley, because he's going to get numbers. He kind of always has. And he's very, very intriguing and very talented. So I think he's a top 5 guy for me. I would lean Jackson a little bit over Bagley, but it's pretty close.
Brad Rowland's joining us on the CK podcast. Okay, I want to get your thoughts on Michael Porter Jr. because I think he's the wild card in this draft. So much upside, but so risky to take him high in the draft. Where do you think he ends up? And do you think the Hawks even give him a look at number 3?
I've not really heard anything about Porter in Atlanta. He didn't work out here. He's not working out. I think that'd be a pretty big surprise. I think of all the guys who are sort of in that consensus top 7 or so prospects, he'd be the guy I'd be most surprised if was drafted by the Hawks. That doesn't mean it's impossible because, as you mentioned, he has a lot of upside. I candidly am not a huge fan of Porter. I think there's just so much risk there with the injuries, and everything you hear about him off the floor, makeup-wise, is not the most encouraging. It's nothing absolutely terrible, but I've not heard anybody go out and sort of vouch for him in the way that his experience at Missouri apparently didn't go very well reportedly, and all that fun stuff. So if you want scoring, if you want upside in that way, I think he's certainly someone that you want to target because at 6'10", Very, very smooth athlete, has real upside and the ability to score 25 points a game in the NBA. But for me, I'm always going to value that like sort of one. I want to say one-dimensional, but it's definitely his sole focus as a scorer. I'm never going to necessarily prioritize that kind of player as highly as some fans would. So that's kind of just my personal bias and belief there on just the kind of player that I like. But there's no denying for his upside. I do think he's very, very talented. And if the medicals check out, that's a huge concern. Obviously, he had another sort of issue, I guess, this week where he had to cancel a workout because of the hip issue. There's a lot going on there with Porter Jr., but if you can get comfortable with all that, he's certainly a top 5 talent in this class. I'm just not sure that it's going to be, that whole package is going to be worth a top 5 pick, if that makes sense.
Brad Rowland is joining us from Peachtree Hoops of SB Nation and Locked on Hawks podcast. Okay, besides number 3, the Hawks have number 19, number 30, and number 33 in the second round. What do you think they do with those picks? And do they trade them, or they stick with them and get some quality players to put on the roster?
Yeah, Travis Schlenk was asked that this morning, actually, his availability, and he says he's very comfortable with taking 4 players. You know, most teams in the league wouldn't want to have 4 rookies in the same class, especially 4 in the top 34 picks. But the Hawks are in this situation where they're doing this rebuild and they have so many roster spots available that taking 4 rookies would not be a weird thing to do, in my opinion. And he said the same thing. He said he's comfortable doing that. You know, in the same breath, it wouldn't be a surprise to anybody if they made a trade or even took a draft and stash kind of player and had that sort of kick the can down the road a little bit, have a guy come over in a year or two. But for me, I'd be just looking to take their best players available. I think defense has been an emphasis for Lloyd Pierce, especially. He's a defense-first coach, and I think the front office is going to probably mirror that to a certain extent, especially with at least some of these picks. They want two-way guys. They want athletes. I think there's a lot of wings and sort of combo guard types in this class that are available between 17 and 18 down to maybe even 35 or 40. There's a lot of those kind of quality. Maybe role player type kind of guys, but I think if you're the Hawks, you can grab 1 or 2 of those players, maybe look with upside somewhere along the way. But this is a pretty deep class for me. There's kind of a drop off from the top tier talent after about 9 or 10. But after that, there's a kind of a huge tier of players who are maybe not all the same, but they all have first round grades for me. But it's one of those things where it's kind of personal preference as to what kind of player that you want, and that can work to the Hawks' advantage because they have these 3 picks. They can just take free swings and hope 1 or 2 of them hit.
Brad, on draft night, who do the Atlanta Hawks take at number 3?
I think if Luka is there, they're going to take him. That's just my guess and what I've been hearing, and that's also what I would do. Mm-hmm. If he is not there, I'm going to guess they take Jaren Jackson Jr. I think that's the most likely in terms of what I've heard and the combination of that in my eyes. So ultimately, I think Luka's probably gone. But with the way the Kings are going, you would obviously know more than I do about the situation at this point in time. But if Luka's on the board, I think they're going to take him. But if he's not, it comes down to probably Jackson Jr., maybe a little bit of Bagley and Young in there. But I would, with the old proverbial gun to my head, I'll say Jackson.
Brad Rowland from Peachtree Hoops and Locked on Hawks podcast. Thank you for joining us right here on Cowbell Kingdom and CK Podcast, episode 341. Good luck, because the draft starts actually with the Atlanta Hawks. Besides 1 and 2, I think everybody kind of knows an idea what the Suns and the Kings want to do, but the real draft starts next week with the Hawks, right? Yeah,
it's been very, very interesting. I think the Hawks have that sort of the keys to the entire draft in a lot of ways at number 3 overall. So I will be holding my breath for the next 6+ days, and I know we all will, especially people that cover the teams at the top of the draft. It's a very, very important night. So we'll all be on pins and needles. I appreciate you having me.
Brad, thank you very much for joining us right here on CK Podcast, and have a great draft next week.
Thanks so much.
That was Brad Rowland, who joined us on Cowbell Kingdom episode 341 to give his thoughts on what the Hawks will do. If you want to get more information about the Atlanta Hawks, follow Brad on Twitter at BT Rowland, or go to SB Nation and check out Peachtree Hoops or the Locked on Hawks podcast. That was Brad Rowland, who joined us on episode 341 of Cowbell Kingdom's podcast.